I want you to just think for a second about why certain places seem to just completely own specific industries. Like how Hollywood is one of the movie capitals of the world. Or, why does Germany so thoroughly dominate the high performance car market? Or why do tech startups practically trip over each other trying to squeeze themselves into Silicon Valley? From the outside, it definitely feels like it's almost magnetic. But underneath that magnetism, there is a deeply structured, very competitive ecosystem at play. And it's easy to just look at that and assume that it's a lucky coincidence, or maybe they just got there first. But economists and business strategists have spent decades trying to decode this exact phenomenon. They want to find the exact recipe for global dominance, so they can replicate it themselves. Welcome back to The Strategy Show, the podcast that connects real world business events with the strategy concepts that help us understand them. I'm Ben Dixon Green, and today our mission is to explore Michael Porter's highly influential 1990 book, The Competitive Advantage of Nations. Now, don't worry, we're not going to go through the entire book, but that book gave birth to the model known as Porter's Diamond. Please drop me a follow and feel free to add a comment to let me know your thoughts on the show. So, as we mentioned, the mission in today's podcast is to explain Porter's Diamond model. It's essentially a framework that is designed to explain how a nation's local environment creates these globally successful industries. And importantly, what we're going to do is stress test it, because the world looks very different today than it did back in 1990 when this was written. So we really need to see where this diamond model cracks under the pressure of our highly globalized digital economy. So let's make a start. Now, what I love about Porter's approach is that he immediately just throws out the old classical economics playbook. The old idea was that a country succeeds simply because it kind of won the geographic lottery. Like it had abundant land or cheap labor or rich soil. The stuff you're just born with as a nation. But Porter argued that there were actually four pillars. There were four things that made a particular country really successful for a given industry. And he introduced the first pillar of his model, what he called factor conditions. Now, these are a country's resources and inputs that firms use to compete in an industry. So they'll include things like labour and land, capital, infrastructure, knowledge and skills. Now, what's interesting is that Porter argues the most important factors for dominance are, in the long term, actually created and not inherited. He argued that if you rely entirely on inherited natural resources, your advantage is fragile because somebody else can always find a cheaper resource. Porter argues that a nation has to constantly build and upgrade specialized human resources or a really deep scientific base. Essentially, you have to manufacture your own advantage. Now, this brings us back to the Hollywood example. People always love to say that the film industry started in Southern California because of the sunny weather, that the good lighting. And sure, having good natural lighting year round was a fantastic inherited factor back in the 1920s. But sunny weather exists in lots of places, and nowadays we have LED lights. Hollywood's true factor condition today is its massive, kind of localized concentration of very specialized labor. You have this kind of constant funnel of writers and directors and cinematographers being churned out by specialized local colleges and training organizations. The creation of that talent is just a powerful engine for the industry. Now, actually, what's even more fascinating about factor conditions is a concept that Porter calls selective disadvantage. He actually argues that sometimes lacking a basic resource, a crucial resource, forces an industry to innovate so radically that they actually leapfrog the global competition. In other words, a weakness actually becomes the catalyst for a superpower. Now, look at Japan in the mid 20th century. Their relative lack of raw materials and natural resources could have been a fatal economic weakness because they had to literally import everything. But because of that, they couldn't afford to waste a single ounce of steel or copper. So Japanese manufacturers were forced into these massive innovations in miniaturization and zero defect manufacturing. They had to figure out how to make things smaller and make them perfectly the very first time. So that desperate need to conserve materials created a manufacturing capability that eventually made them globally dominant. But having brilliant engineers who know how to miniaturize things isn't really enough if nobody actually wants to buy what you're making. And that brings us to the second pillar of Porter's Diamond, which is demand conditions. These are your local buyers. Porter argues that in order to become a globally dominant industry, your home market customers need to be really demanding and sophisticated. Basically, they have to be an absolute nightmare to please. Why? Well, the home market essentially acts as an early warning system for global trends. If your local customers have got really high standards, or there are very specific kind of difficult needs that they have, your companies are forced to solve very complex problems before they even step onto the world stage. The Japanese air conditioning industry is a perfect illustration of this mechanism. Just imagine living in a tightly packed Tokyo apartment in the 1980s. You're dealing with incredibly hot, suffocatingly humid summers. And you're living shoulder to shoulder with your neighbours in a country with really high energy costs. So Japanese consumers didn't just want an appliance that blew cold air. They demanded air conditioning units that were dead quiet so they wouldn't disturb the neighbours. They had to be incredibly compact to fit in those tiny apartments. And they also had to be highly energy efficient so they wouldn't bankrupt the user or, blow out the local power grid. So the local environment just forced companies like Panasonic into an engineering corner. They had to invent kind of ultra quiet, compact, efficient ACs just to survive their own domestic market. And once they solved those incredibly difficult local problems, taking those advanced products to a global market where consumers actually had much lower expectations meant that they wiped the floor with the international competition because they'd already fought the hardest battles at home. But solving those engineering challenges requires more than just having smart designers. It also requires specialized parts. And that leads us to the third pillar in Porter's Diamond, which is related and supporting industries. Porter emphasizes that success absolutely does not happen in isolation. It happens in what he calls clusters. This is the geographic concentration of interconnected companies and suppliers in the country. Because an engineer at a Japanese AC company can't build a whisper quiet unit if the only motors available to them are clunky and loud and imported from halfway across the world. They need a local ecosystem of suppliers who are just as innovative as they are. Toyota's historical position in the auto industry is actually deeply tied to this cluster effect too. Toyota doesn't just buy generic parts out of a catalogue. They rely on having world-class local suppliers in Japan, like Denso. And because these suppliers are geographically close, information just flows freely. Toyota and Denso engineers can literally walk into each other's facilities, co-develop new technologies, and then get them out there rapidly onto the open market. Porter argued you simply cannot be a world beater if the underlying components of your product are second-rate. Now, we actually see the same cluster effect in services too. Like London didn't just become a global financial hub because a few banks decided to open their offices there. It's a dense cluster where, yes, you've got some global banks, but they're surrounded by the world's best legal services, accounting firms, and specialized financial IT infrastructure. They feed off each other's expertise. But here's the catch. Even if you have the best specialized talent, you've got demanding local buyers, and you've got a world-class network of suppliers, companies can still get lazy if they don't have anyone pushing them. Which brings us to the final and arguably the most intense pillar of the diamond, which is firms' strategy, structure, and rivalry. This is the domestic competition. Porter found that the strongest predictor of global success was the presence of fierce, almost cutthroat domestic rivals. For example, we could look at Italy's luxury fashion industry to explain this. You have brands like Gucci and Prada and Versace, and they're all crammed into the same country. And they aren't just casually coexisting. They're fighting an all-out war for window space in Milan. They're poaching the best designers from each other, and they're battling for brand awareness in front of probably the most fashion-conscious consumers on earth. That intense local rivalry forces them to drive down inefficiencies, to improve their fabric quality, and to push the boundaries of design. Because if you can survive the Italian fashion market against those domestic rivals, then you are definitely prepared to dominate Paris, New York, or Tokyo. And Porter points, funnily enough, at a really fascinating psychological element here as well. Companies love to complain that foreign rivals have got unfair advantages, like they've got cheaper labour or they've got government subsidies. But with domestic rivals, those excuses just vanish. You face the exact same labour costs, the same local regulations, the same cultural environment. The only way to win is simply to be better. And that's the last of our 4 pillars within Porter's Diamond. Now, if we visualize this entire model, it feels a lot like forging an actual diamond. You start with the raw carbon, those factor conditions that we talked about. But carbon on its own doesn't do much. You need that intense, crushing pressure of those demanding local buyers and domestic rivalry, all held together by this solid structure of supporting industries. Because if you remove the pressure, you don't get a diamond, you just end up with a lump of coal. But forging that diamond doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are some external forces that can either dramatically crank up the heat or just shatter the stone completely. Porter includes 2 critical elements that act as either accelerators or disruptors to the 4 pillars. And those critical elements are chance and government. Now let's look at chance first. This is the unpredictable shock to the system. Chance events are massive disruptions. They're things like global wars or sudden technological breakthroughs like AI or a geopolitical crisis. They're things that nobody can really plan for, although we do seem to be living through them on a monthly basis at the moment. What's fascinating here is that these chance events often unfreeze the current industry structure. They disrupt the old guard of companies, creating a sudden crisis that allows a new nation's firms who happen to have the right diamond in place to completely take over. The 1970s oil shock is a classic example of this mechanism. For decades, American automakers dominated the world because fuel was incredibly cheap in the US. So they were building massive, heavy cars with V8 engines which just ate fuel. But suddenly, overnight in the 70s, thanks to a major oil shock, global energy costs just skyrocketed. Now, Japan, as we mentioned earlier, was already very exposed to energy costs. So they'd built their local diamond around energy conservation and miniaturization. So when that oil shock hit, which was a pure chance event, it perfectly aligned with Japan's pre-existing ecosystem. Now, American car makers were absolutely paralyzed, but Japan's smaller, highly efficient cars just flooded the global market and fundamentally reshaped the auto industry right down to this day. So chance kind of changes the board that you're playing on, but the diamond then determines who is best equipped to capitalize on that new reality. The second external force that Porter mentions is government. And this is an area where politicians, and actually quite often even business leaders, frequently misunderstand Porter's work. When people hear about the government's role in business, they usually assume that it means that the government should kind of wrap national industries in bubble wrap. They think they should be giving them massive subsidies to create a national monopoly, or putting up huge tariffs to block foreign competition so that the local companies feel safe. But actually, bubble wrap is the fastest way to kill the diamond. Porter argued the government's role is to act as a catalyst and a harsh trainer. He argued that artificial protection is actually bad, because what protectionism does is it kind of artificially destroys the rivalry pillar. If a government guarantees a company's survival, then that company just stops innovating because it doesn't need to. Instead, Porter argued that governments should be enforcing strict product standards, aggressive environmental regulations, and robust antitrust laws, because those policies force companies to raise the quality of what they do, and it makes them more innovative. So by forcing local companies to meet really strict safety or environmental standards, the government's kind of artificially increasing the pressure of the demand conditions. That, put it another way, they're acting like the demanding customer. It kind of reminds me of the cautionary tale of Kodak. Kodak was a company that rested on its laurels. The US government didn't push them, and Kodak got to the point where they functionally operated as a domestic monopoly in cameras, films, and developing. And because they lacked that intense kind of existential domestic rivalry, they failed to take the threat of digital photography seriously. Meanwhile, over in Japan, consumer electronics companies were locked in this sort of death match with each other, and that was driving rapid digital innovation. By the time Kodak realized what was happening, Japanese firms like Sony and Canon had already built the future of photography. So the government's true job is to keep the pressure high so that companies never get comfortable. So how do we use Porter's model in the real world? Well, there are a few applications. The first one, and possibly the most obvious one, is that Porter's model provides a roadmap for how a nation develops a particular industry. And we can see this happening in the real world. Take the Chinese automotive industry. The international benchmark reports show that in the late 1990s, China's domestic car production couldn't even compete with a single mid-sized auto company in the rest of the world. They were way behind. But they didn't just accept their position as a source of cheap, plentiful labour. China aggressively started building the pillars of their diamond. They poured resources into engineering universities, creating factor conditions. They fostered intense rivalry between dozens of domestic startups. And by 2018, China was the world's largest auto producer. And they didn't just win on volume. They leaped past the combustion engine era entirely and started dominating global electric vehicle technology. They systematically climbed the diamond. So that's one way of using Porter's diamond. Next up, a country like the UK might look at an important industry like the financial services industry and use the diamond to consider how to protect it. Now, rather than putting in place tariffs to keep out competition, they might focus on enhancing regulation and local competition to try and build innovation and competitiveness, while also supporting the related industries like putting money into financial education colleges or legal firms that those financial services need to operate in. So that can be another useful way of utilizing Porter's diamond. Finally, you might see the diamond used to help a company decide if a new country is suitable to expand into. Let's say we're a UK supermarket and we want to expand into the Brazilian market. the supermarket would have to ask itself if it could access the factors that it needs to operate in Brazil. So, can it access the land that it needs for its stores? And can it access the staff that it needs for its operations, and so on? Brazil would need to also have the necessary related and supporting industries that supermarket would need. So, hauliers, farmers, food processing businesses. And it would also need the demand for the products that the supermarket was planning to sell. Finally, the supermarket would need to consider its own strategy, structure, and rivalry. Is the supermarket used to competition in its home UK market? Is it efficient and innovative? If it isn't, it may struggle to make a success in a brand new market that it needs to be able to adapt to. If the supermarket doesn't believe that all 4 of those pillars are available for the Brazilian market, it might decide that foreign expansion isn't sensible. So, Porter's model is incredibly useful as part of business strategy and also government policy. But as foundational as that diamond model is, we have to look critically at its blind spots. I mean, to be fair, no economic theory from 1990 is going to map perfectly onto the modern world without at least a few cracks showing. And there are some significant criticisms from modern scholars. Now, very often their main issue kind of strikes at the heart of Porter's dismissal of natural resources. Remember that Porter claims that the basic inherited factors don't create sustained competitive advantage. But a lot of modern theorists argue that actually sustained advantage can happen without that kind of high pressure ecosystem that Porter describes. Canada is a prime example of this issue. Canada possesses massive amounts of kind of oil, gas, metals, wood, all those sorts of things. And it also possesses massive globally competitive industries in forestry, mining, and oil extraction. These sectors emerged on the global map almost entirely due to Canada's abundant natural factor endowments. They didn't necessarily need the intense domestic rivalry or sophisticated local demand to succeed. Canada just possessed vast quantities of resources that the global market really needed, and they built global success around managing them efficiently. So that's a huge exception to Porter's rule. And actually, it leads us to another massive issue in the model, which is the role of foreign demand. Because Porter is absolutely adamant that a strong, sophisticated domestic market is the essential kind of pressure cooker for success. But if local demand is absolutely required, how do you explain a global titan like Nestle? Nestle pulls the vast majority of its massive earnings from foreign sales. Their global dominance wasn't forced because the Swiss population happened to each be drinking gallons of hot chocolate and eating tons of chocolate bars every year at home. The domestic market was far too small to support their growth. The reason Nestle did so well was because they bypassed the local demand pillar entirely and immediately looked outward to kind of satisfy foreign consumers. So this completely contradicts the idea that the home market is the ultimate early warning system. And I guess really it reveals that Porter's model might just be too rigid. We have to remember the context of when Porter was writing. All the way back in 1990, the global economy was dominated by the US, Europe, and Japan. But today, the kind of trans-border reality of business almost makes the concept of a national diamond really blurry. For example, consider the Upper Rhine Valley in Europe to illustrate this. It's a region where kind of France, Germany, and Switzerland all intersect. And they have this massive, highly innovative economic cluster that spans all 3 borders. But if you try and apply Porter's diamond to it, the model just breaks down because all of our economic statistics are measured by individual nations. So, for example, how do you quantify the domestic rivalry or local factors when the engineers live in France, they commute to a lab in Germany, and they receive their venture capital from a bank in Switzerland? You can't. The cluster acts as one kind of unified, brilliant hub, but the national data can't capture it. So, bringing all this theory back down to earth, let's summarize why an understanding of a framework from the 1990s matters to you, the listener, today. Well, if you're an entrepreneur or a business leader looking to expand internationally, Porter's Diamond is essentially a diagnostic tool. You can use it to run a market entry feasibility analysis. Instead of just looking for cheap labour, you can evaluate if a target country actually has the supporting industries and the local demand that are necessary to sustain your business. Or, on a more local level, it helps all of us understand why our local or our city governments or our national governments are offering massive tax breaks to attract a specific group of tech companies or manufacturers. They aren't just trying to get a few jobs, they're desperately trying to ignite a cluster. They're trying to build the diamond. So the model can help completely shift your perspective. It shows you that lasting success isn't just about having a clever product or cutting costs. It's actually about the ecosystem that you operate within. Those constant forces that pressure you to be faster and sharper and more innovative than you were yesterday. The diamond shows us that true competitive advantage is kind of forged in the fires of demanding customers and fierce rivals and world-class supporting networks. But as we look to the future, I want to leave you with a final thought. If Porter's Diamond fundamentally relies on physical clustering and kind of face-to-face knowledge exchange and localized domestic demand, what happens to the diamond in a fully remote AI-driven world? Imagine a startup founded entirely on the internet today. On day one, its 50 employees are scattered across 30 different countries collaborating in the cloud. Its supporting infrastructure is a decentralized blockchain, and its very first paying customer is an AI algorithm operating on a server halfway across the globe. In that completely borderless reality, does the concept of a home nation even matter anymore? If the business exists entirely in the cloud, what does the country matter? I'll leave you to think about that. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Strategy Show. If you enjoyed it or you found it useful, or hopefully both, please follow the podcast so you won't miss future episodes. And please feel free to drop a comment on the episode. And I'll see you next time.